Civil rights groups have retraced the route of a historic 1965 march to protest against new voting laws they say will disenfranchise millions. Now one group is calling on the United Nations to come to the US to investigate. You're watching Inside Story US 2012 from Washington. Hello, I'm Shihab Ratansi. A leading civil rights group in the United States has called it the greatest attack on voting rights since segregation. Nearly 50 years since the historic protests in the southern US calling for equal voting rights for African Americans, thousands have marched again from Selma to Montgomery in Alabama. The issue in 2012, new laws in more than a dozen US states which could discourage millions from voting, in particular students, ethnic minorities and immigrants. In Texas, voters are now required to show photo identification. The US government blocked that provision on Monday, though, concerned it would disproportionately affect the Hispanic population, 300,000 of whom don't carry ID. South Carolina's similar law was blocked in December. Supporters of the laws, the majority of which have been introduced in Republican-controlled states, say they will ensure the integrity of the elections by clamping down on fraud and stopping undocumented migrants from voting. But now the NAACP, the country's oldest African-American civil rights group, is in Switzerland, appealing to the United Nations Human Rights Council. I spoke to the NAACP's Hilary Shelton in Geneva, who just made his presentation. I asked him if he was able to make a case that the laws were a deliberate attempt to disenfranchise.
Certainly we were able to show them the statistical data. It showed them how partisan this very well is, and that this entire movement seems to be predicated on those that want to win elections by locking so many people out of the polling access or being able to participate in the election process. We showed them how, indeed, with the very few cases of fraud that actually included someone pretending to be someone else, and there were so few, that this process would lock 5 million Americans out of the polling place and out of the option to participate in the democracy. So by showing them the effect, indeed you can see that this was, if it is a problem, that this indeed was not the solution.
Do you really feel that there is a strong parallel to the arguments raised in 1947 at the UN Human Rights Council by the NAACP? Do you feel that historical parallel there in this moment?
Oh, in too many ways. Even as much as in 1947, when the NAACP went, the forms of oppression or disenfranchisement utilized then were done in a much more brazen way, where they'd say, we want to lock African Americans out of the polls, where in state legislatures they would actually say that the reason they were doing this, implementing photo ID bills or other forms of disenfranchisement, was to make sure that, quote, the darker race would not be a challenge in states like Virginia. It would not be able to participate in their electoral process. But even as we look at it now, we're seeing that as much as the language isn't the same, the strategy in many ways is. As we say that the struggle in 1947 was a struggle over Jim Crow. As we know in the United States, those old laws and strategies put in place to prevent African Americans from being able to fully participate in our electoral process. But then what we're seeing now is the same strategy, but utilizing new technologies. So we refer to that as James E. Crow Esquire. Equally as disenfranchising, as racist and discriminatory as ever before, but more sophisticated than ever before in how they go about doing it.
But do you think it still is racism that's driving this, or simple party politics, or even wider issues of demographic change?
Well, the racism under Jim Crow wasn't that simple either. Keep in mind, when they passed these provisions in states like Virginia, they said so they could have continued control over the electoral system, the political process. So they would continue to be able to rule things even though more racial and ethnic minorities were in the state and should very well have some say-so as well. So we know that African Americans became disposable. And if you look at the definition of racism, racism is racial prejudice plus power. Being able to grasp the power, and that's what this is all about, is a power grab to be able to control the purse strings of their states or even of the U.S. government.
Very quickly, what do you want the UN to do? And of course, you're aware that in 1947, the NAACP was unsuccessful in its petition to the United Nations.
Well, what we want the UN to do in this case is to monitor what's going on, to actually look at what's happening and how it affects racial and ethnic minorities, not only in the United States, but its impact throughout the world. To do a report, to actually observe the election process and see what the impact's going to be, but also to share that information with other countries across the world so they won't have this kind of problem. We know the way this is being presented now, as you asked the question, is it being driven simply by race? It's hard to tell until you actually do the analysis and see who's most heavily impacted.
To discuss the motivation behind these new laws and how they could affect the results of November's elections, we're joined from Madison, Wisconsin by John Nichols from The Nation magazine, who's written extensively on this issue. Also joined here in the studio by Christian Adams, a supporter of the new laws who used to work for the US Department of Justice. And also by Marcia Johnson-Blanco from the Lawyers Committee for Civil Rights Under Law. Christian Adams, then, first of all, that's the main argument. This is all legislation for a problem or against a problem that doesn't exist.
Well, that's false. I've proven voter fraud impersonation in federal court. I quantify it all the time. It's widespread. But more importantly, this is...
Where's the evidence then? No one can come up with any evidence.
Well, no one's looking very hard then, because I've proven it in federal court. I've proven in-person voter impersonation fraud in federal district court in the Southern District of Mississippi.
How many times?
Well, I mean, how many times do you need? Well, how much voter fraud is okay? I mean, there are cases in Oregon where people are voting for dead people. There are states around the country that have more people on the voter rolls than there are people alive. So we know we have a quantitative problem in the United States. This is an enormous strategic miscalculation by the NAACP. Voter ID is wildly popular in the United States. 80% of Americans support it. African Americans support it by majority numbers. Hispanics, Democrats, Republicans, it's widespread support. So for him to go off to Geneva and to jet off there to bring the UN is a dangerous situation for the NAACP, because Americans don't want to see the UN monitoring elections.
Before we go on, let's take a look at what exactly is being discussing. As far as these new voting laws are concerned, 38 states are considering or have passed legislation which would require photo ID to be presented before voting. 11% of eligible US voters don't carry government-issued identification, according to the Brennan Center for Justice. That percentage is even higher, though, for a number of social groups, including ethnic minorities. As for that level of voter fraud, according to the same organization, it's extremely low. For example, in Wisconsin, it was 0.0002% in the 2004 presidential election. But Marcia Johnson-Blanco, the other argument is, okay, it may not be a problem, but maybe it is also common sense and not a bad idea. What's so difficult about getting voter ID just to make sure?
Well, the difficulty is that in order to get the voter ID, you need to get underlying documents, either a birth certificate or proof of citizenship. And those underlying documents are costly. You have to take time off to go to work, to go to the motor vehicles. And I do want to respond to something that Christian said about the popularity of voter ID laws. Mississippi had a referendum last November where it passed the voter ID law 62-38. But my organization, the Lawyers Committee, we did an analysis of the vote and found that 75% of African Americans in Mississippi voted against the voter ID law. So there, the popularity was tested, looking at minorities, how minorities felt about the law, and there they came out against.
But why is it so difficult to get a photo ID?
It's difficult to get a photo ID because their statistics show that as many as a quarter of African Americans lack photo ID. And as I mentioned before, in order to get the ID, you have to get the underlying documents. There have been stories in the media about folks without a birth certificate. So without a birth certificate, you can't get the ID. Without a Social Security card, you can't get the ID. We've had someone who've called into our 866-our-VOTE hotline who doesn't have the underlying documents in South Carolina. He won't be able to vote because he cannot
That's not true.
get an ID.
In South Carolina, there are exceptions. People who can't get the underlying documents can execute an affidavit in court, in the voting place saying, I can't get the underlying documents, and they're still allowed to vote. So there's a lot of...
Couldn't they be prosecuted afterwards?
Absolutely not. This is an exception in the law. And so there's a lot of myths and falsehoods. That Brennan Center you cited, the study on voter fraud, totally fabricated figures. The Brennan Center report did not even include cases that I won in federal court proving voter fraud.
Okay, John Nichols, what about that point then? I mean, it's often said that this isn't a problem, but it's partly because either because of misreporting or because people aren't simply looking.
Well, in preparation for today's conversation, I actually called some clerks and heads of organizations of county clerks, city clerks around the country, as well as some key League of Women Voters heads around the country, and said, you know, look, we always hear this back and forth about voter fraud. You people are in the front lines. You're actually running elections or observing elections. You do so from a nonpartisan standpoint. What's your view? And 2-1, they said, there simply is no serious problem in the United States with voter fraud. There are a handful of instances, and such a statistically minimal number that no one serious would focus on them. But those handful of instances, even when they do occur, frequently are mistakes rather than outright fraud. Someone who many years ago was convicted of a crime and under the laws of the state is not allowed to vote, but does go and vote having either forgotten or not known that they were not allowed to do so. These are not classic voting fraud instances. In fact, one of the interesting things that was pointed out to me was that in the U.S. today, most experts on election law say there is dramatically less voter fraud than there was 20 years ago and epically less than there was 50 years ago. So amazingly enough, we seem to be dealing with a problem that has been in steady decline over the last several decades.
Christian Adams, I mean, that's one of the reasons why people think this is actually simply a deliberate and systematic attempt to disenfranchise millions who traditionally lean Democratic. It's also when taken in conjunction with various other provisions like preventing early voting or same-day registration or voter drives for that matter, which really don't seem to have that much to do with election fraud. What does early voting have to do with
Well, others think that people that say there's not voter fraud are part of a deliberate and systematic attempt to give a smokescreen to criminal activity.
But they have statistics on this.
Those statistics are phony. Look, calling the League of Women Voters a nonpartisan group that is on the front lines of election administration tells you everything you need to know about those assertions, because they're not on the front lines of election administration.
Do we currently have a legitimate government then? I mean, how serious are you saying this is then? Have we simply not had democracy in America?
How much voter fraud is okay? I mean, are we to
John, just a moment.
How much voter fraud is okay? I mean, 1 unit, 2 unit, 10 units?
I think I've just heard an absurd statement, though.
All right, John, go ahead very quickly.
To attack the League of Women Voters. To attack organizations.
I didn't attack them. I attacked your characterization of them, which was false. You provided a false characterization.
Attacked.
No, I didn't, sir. I attacked your false characterization of them.
Of women voters, and now you are accusing me
of deliberately providing a false characterization of them. Absolutely correct.
When, in fact, the League of Women Voters has been involved since 1920. In the United States and states across the country.
What elections do they run? What elections do they run?
They don't. And I
did
not.
You.
Now, Christian, young man, I can't see you, so I don't know if you're young. I assume you aren't very experienced. But you have just said, you've just misquoted me. I said that I talked to clerks, to people who run elections around the country.
And you know as well as I do that's not a way to do a quantitative analysis of voter fraud. No, sir.
Christian,
you know that is not how.
I'm afraid for time purposes, we're going to have to move on.
You have just tried to move off the topic when I've proven you to have deliberately mischaracterized what I said.
All right, well, let's try and accurately characterize the arguments, John. We have all these different issues from pushing back same-day registration and everything else. Eric Holder actually recently spoke, the current Attorney General, whom you once worked for, and he put it into a wider picture of again, systematically try and prevent the vote from coming out in the first place. And he recalled what happened in 2004. But this is what Eric Holder, this is the pattern of activity that Eric Holder put it into.
From literacy tests and poll taxes to misinformation campaigns telling people that Election Day has been moved or that only one adult per household can cast a ballot. Before the 2004 elections, flyers were distributed in minority neighborhoods in Milwaukee, falsely claiming that, and I quote again, if anybody in your family has ever been found guilty of a crime, you can't vote in the presidential election, unquote. And you risk a 10-year prison sentence if you do.
That's Eric Holder there again suggesting that this is all part of a wider attempt, not just, I mean, also to do with redistricting and the purging of voter rolls, that there is something coordinated afoot. But I would take it then that you don't believe that's true.
Well, somebody ought to let the Democrats in the state of Rhode Island, the African-American senator who supported the voter ID law in Rhode Island, in on this conspiracy. Somebody ought to let the Democratic governor who signed the bill in on this conspiracy. Somebody ought to let Arthur Davis, an African-American congressman from Alabama, who now supports voter ID, in on this conspiracy, because Mr. Davis said voter ID is an effective way to stop the voter fraud that he personally witnessed in his congressional district in Alabama.
Marcia Johnson-Blanco then, I mean, do you feel then, I mean, do you think there is some overarching campaign to prevent certain sections of the population voting, or are you convinced by Christian Adams' arguments there?
No, I'm not convinced by his arguments. I think one needs only to look at what happened after the 2010 elections, when legislature after legislature started introducing similar voter ID laws across the country. And as you mentioned, 38 have introduced. Now we were going to have about 10, including Virginia and Pennsylvania shortly, passing these laws. And we need to look at what the effect of these laws are going to be. The Brennan Center has done a credible study looking at who will be affected by these laws. And it's really a question, I believe, of who gets to participate in our democracy. Where does the burden lie? Christian Adams is talking about voter fraud, yet can't show. He mentions the case in Noxubee, Mississippi, which was prosecuted, and there are laws currently in place to address that. But when you institute laws that will keep millions, potentially millions, from the ballot, I think that's a problem.
John Nichols, I mean, we sometimes do hear, and we see reports, well, actually, after President Obama was elected, there were reports that Karl Rove and others started sort of being a little alarmed by his appeal to new voters, for example. And then we see groups like the American Legislative Council, ALEC as it's known, who a lot of this legislation, or at least in some cases, this legislation in various states for photo IDs has been traced back to. How credible do you think, again, do they add to your sense that there is something afoot that's more than just simply spontaneous reactions to voter fraud in various states?
Well, as I think we've established pretty well in this discussion, voter fraud is not a serious problem in the United States today. What we do have is a great challenge with how we get people to the polls, and in some cases the expansion of the electorate. There are always people in politics who are going to be very, very uncomfortable with an expanded electorate, with bringing more people into the process. A century ago, we had a great struggle in this country on whether to even allow women to vote. 50 years ago, we had a great struggle on whether even to allow African Americans to vote. As we've expanded the franchise and brought more people into the process, there have always been efforts to claim that these new players will be fraudulent or inept or in some other way bad players. The reality is, in the United States, every time we've expanded the process, it's gotten better. It's gotten more open, more functional.
But John, I mean, help us understand the mechanism.
We are at such a point now.
If there is a campaign, though, I mean, do you find it credible then that organizations like ALEC are colluding with legislators to draft legislation on these topics? Do you have evidence of that? How does that work?
Oh, well, there's no question that the American Legislative Exchange Council, which is largely funded by multinational corporations, has worked very, very closely with many legislators across the country to develop model legislation for very, very strict voter ID laws and for a number of other instances and interventions that are referred to as voter suppression. There's no question of that. In fact, ALEC state chairs and ALEC board members have been some of the prime movers around the country on pushing for the passage of very strict voter ID laws. These are the laws that in recent instances have been not only blocked from implementation via the Department of Justice, but also in recent days have been struck down by judges on an argument that they are unconstitutional, that they are so strict that they narrow access to the political process by particular groups. Now, it is not a surprise that there are organizations that would like to narrow the process so that it is less likely to include voters who might not vote the way they want elections to turn out.
In fact, we did ask ALEC to come on the show, and they sent us a a statement. They said, while ALEC does have a voter ID model legislation, or rather has voter ID model legislation, we have no resources dedicated to the issue and not much to say. Thanks for the offer, but we'll pass. I mean, they say that there's nothing sinister about this. This is just part of the democratic process and about guiding legislation, particularly in a time when the Supreme Court itself says corporations do have a stake in democracy and have a political voice. Marcia.
Yeah, well, I would say the people who are not going to be allowed to vote because they don't have access to this, and let's be clear, it's a very limited form of ID. It's unexpired, government-issued photo identification. Rhode Island, for example, includes, I believe, non-photo ID in its laws.
Right.
You can expand that pool. Why are they making it such a limited pool of ID that is keeping millions from our democracy?
But Christian Anderson, why is ALEC interested in this, though, do you think, given that, I mean, much of the lobbying that they do, much of the legislation they do is to deregulate the economy and deregulate things. Why suddenly do they feel that they need to draft model legislation that actually imposes more regulation on the voting process?
Well, look, the reason they're doing that is because people want it. 80% of Americans support voter ID. They draft their scriveners, they pass it on to legislators who introduce it. Laws don't pass because ALEC drafted a model bill. They pass because the public supports it. And in places like Georgia and South Carolina, they'll actually come to your house and pick you up and take you to get your photo ID. This is not some sort of onerous requirement if a taxi is showing up. Look, John Nichols talks about the law in Wisconsin being struck down. The law in Georgia was struck down in a case where the civil rights groups wasted an enormous amount of energy and resources fighting the Georgia voter ID law. And eventually, every single court that looked at it upheld it as constitutional because the plaintiffs, the NAACP, could not even find a single person who could not get photo ID in Georgia. That's how ridiculous these arguments are.
John Nichols?
Well, I'm intrigued that Christian has compared Georgia to Wisconsin. They're very different laws, drawn very differently. The judge who ruled this week in Wisconsin striking down the Wisconsin voter ID law, which has generally been portrayed as the strictest in the country, said specifically that it was a violation of the Wisconsin Constitution. And the thing that he focused on most importantly was the reality, in his view, had been proven to him, that substantial numbers of people would not only be denied access to voting, but that would have to jump through hoops, that it would be a difficult process. So even if the cab might be sent to your house, that hours would be taken out of your day trying to develop some sort of new identification model that would allow you to vote, when up to this point you've been able to vote without all that. And what this judge said, and I thought it was a very powerful statement, is that these voter ID laws, with the barriers that they erect, run the risk of undermining the democratic legitimacy of state, county, and even national government.
Which, of course, nobody makes that argument in the states that have voter ID. I mean, nobody is saying the legitimacy.
Well, I'm sorry, Wisconsin had voter ID until Monday.
No, nobody is making the argument that the state of Florida,
so the argument was made.
The state of Georgia, all the states that have voter ID in place, nobody is saying these governments are illegitimate. That isn't a credible argument.
We have 2 minutes left. I mean, underlying all this, Marcia Johnson-Blanco, John, we'll have to move on. The underlying all this, though, is you wonder. I mean, there's an argument that the Department of Justice is reluctant to take some of these cases on because they think that if this does get to the Supreme Court, and many of these cases are taken on by the federal authorities under the Voting Rights Act of '65, that under this particular Supreme Court, the Supreme Court might decide, look, there's no place for the Voting Rights Act of '65, which protects minorities' voting rights, because this isn't 1965 anymore. What would you make of that argument?
Well, the Justice Department has taken it on. It's objected to South Carolina's ID law. It's objected to Texas's ID law. Now, those states are in D.C. District Court challenging not only their right to pass the laws.
So the argument will be that we don't need, we have electoral equality now, we don't need these safeguards. What would your argument be against that?
Well, the great thing about Section 5 of the Voting Rights Act is that the burden is on the states to prove that these laws do not have a discriminatory effect or a disproportionately negative effect on minorities. And the Justice Department's data show that it does. And I would also add that these states are not now only fighting for ID, they're they're challenging the constitutionality of Section 5 of the Voting Rights Act. So they're not just
which ensures that certain ethnic minorities aren't discriminated against.
Which ensures that states cannot pass laws that discriminate against minority voters. Their voting laws are subject to review. So it's not just ID that's under attack, it's also the Voting Rights Act.
And with that, we have to leave it. Marcia Johnson-Blanco, thank you very much. Christian Adams, thank you. John Nichols, thank you very much too. That's it from the Inside Story team in Washington, D.C. Don't forget to follow us on Twitter and Facebook, where you can find more information about the program. And we want to hear from you. Tell us what stories you think we should be covering. Send your ideas to us directly at InsideStory@aljazeera.net.